Hello, I'm Dr. Diane Collard. I'm so sorry I can't be with you today, but I'm very privileged to be invited to share my story. I believe passionately in the role of the arts in church and in faith, and I'm excited to share with you how God brought me into this view and this position. I didn't enter it as most people do. I'm not an artist myself, but it was in the midst of the deepest grief time of my life. My husband and I have been missionaries for 30 years, and we were living in Vienna, working in the former Eastern Europe. And the end of September of 1992, we received the call that our son in California had been murdered during the night, and that threw me into the deepest, deepest despair. It was almost 2 months later in Vienna that I received an envelope, and out of that envelope fell the Polaroid picture of our son's gravestone that had been placed on his grave. And at that moment, the reality that our son was really dead overwhelmed me. And I couldn't stay in the apartment, so I left and went downtown and started walking the little lanes. Well, in the first week of December, it was very cold and snowy, and I had to get in somewhere, so I decided to go to the Kunsthistorische Museum. This is the Art History Museum. And in the Art History Museum, I found that my soul resonated with pictures of war and despair and destruction. And then it was the Passion of Christ, and especially those paintings of Mary holding her son in her arms. After a while, I got rather embarrassed because this went on for days. I would bury myself there. I got rather embarrassed and decided I needed to go elsewhere. I had no background in abstract art. In fact, I'd been taught that abstract expressionism was a form of anarchy, godlessness, and not to be appreciated. But I went in God's providence, to the Albertina Museum, the Modern Art Museum of Vienna, and found myself in a room surrounded by paintings of nothing but line, color, design, form, texture, space, crying out to my God, "What am I doing here, Father?" And it was in that time that God, in his sovereignty, met me. Very clearly in my head, in my heart, said Diane, I am the original abstract artist. Everything that is created was created from my imagination alone. And before Genesis 1:1, before anything was created, I had created in my own imagination the abstract elements of line, color, form, design, space, texture. And just as I made everything you see that is beautiful in creation from these pieces, I can take the broken pieces of your heart and make something beautiful again if you'll just trust me. And I worshiped my God, not the paintings. I worshiped the Creator God, and in that worship began my healing process. And out of that worship came a new calling, not one that I could have ever made up for myself, and that was to find and encourage artists of faith. I began a journey. I didn't know any artists of faith. So wherever I went in Europe or in the US, I began asking, does anybody know an artist? May I talk to any artist of faith? And in doing so, I learned of many of them, how much despair and alienation and lack of hope they had. My heart was broken because that despair and alienation didn't come from the world toward these artists. It came from the church itself. And because of that, and because I had learned as an intercultural trainer doing cultural investigation research that the language of spirituality of then what we call the postmodern Europe, the language was the arts, and yet the church did not speak it. In fact, the church was alienated, isolating the artist from the ministry. Out of that eventually became my dissertation. And my dissertation looked at the role of visual art in the free non-state churches, in specifically Germany and Switzerland, the birthplace of the Reformation, and Spain, the birthplace of the Counter-Reformation. This is what I found. I found that there was an alienation. 66% of the artists of faith in Germany were not currently part of a local evangelical assembly. And I didn't find the same in Spain. I found that the artists were still part of the church, but nobody, not one of them, until I asked the question, thought that God had anything to do with their creative gift, or that God expected them and desired them to use it in service for Him. They had completely bifurcated their creative gift and their service and worship of God. I found that there were three main reasons from the pastors, really four reasons given as to why art was not embraced in the ministry of the church, or even to support artists in the marketplace. Number one was a theological reason. A theological reason dealing with the post-Reformational theology that declared that the role of the image, that anything that had to do with an image was not to be part of the church. And therefore you had Calvin, who taught that anything of the visual would become an idol, or Zwingli, who at one point preached that you could only worship God with 4 whitewashed walls. A deep theological reason. The second reason was a traditional reason. We've never done this before. But that grew out of their theology, and because of their theology, they never questioned what God's view of the arts really is in His scripture. The third reason was a few, not very many, pastors who said, I might consider embracing art or supporting artists, but I just don't know how. A very practical reason. And fourthly, which always gets a chuckle of my artist in a long discussion afterwards, was that artists are problematic people and difficult to work with. I'll leave that at that point. I believe that the seminary is key to the change of what God is doing. God is now creating in His kingdom and in His sovereignty, using artists, especially in Europe and the U.S., but around the world, using them to declare His glory in the marketplace, in academia, in missions, and in the church. And I believe it should begin with a seminary education that is training our pastors and our Christian leaders so that they have an understanding of God's view of the arts and the power of the arts. I am encouraged that Gordon-Conwell is considering this weekend. But I hope it's not a one-time discussion. I'd love to see a curriculum that includes for everyone who goes through the seminary a course on God's view of the arts, the theology of aesthetics, how to practically use and encourage the arts in the culture as well as the culture of the church. I applaud you for this weekend. I hope that I can be a part of that conversation in the future. And I look forward to talking to many of you. In Charlotte, we're starting a new initiative called Arts Charlotte, for artists of faith to begin to have a community as well as to reach into the culture at large and represent Christ as light and that sweet aroma of Christ. I'm also the Europe Director for Artist and Christian Testimony and would be delighted to talk to any of you who might be considering serving God in a more direct way through your art. Thank you for this opportunity. I just am so excited and really know that God's going to use this in a mighty way to bring Him glory and to bring hope to others and to bring about a renewal of faith in our culture. Thank you so much. Goodbye.